Long before towers crowned the hills of Cyrodiil, before men tilled soil and measured seasons, there was only starlight. It fell like silver rain across the unshaped land, and from its glow the Ayleids drew their first breath. They called themselves the people of the dawn, the wild elves, and claimed kinship with the constellations above. For them, the firmament was not a distant sky, but a great window through which the divine looked down. In those early days, Tamriel was raw and unsettled, a realm still bearing the marks of creation's first turbulence. Where rivers carved valleys and mountains pressed upward, the Ayleids wandered with reverence. They were not yet rulers, nor builders of stone. Instead, they were dreamers. They believed themselves children of Magnus, the architect of Magicka, and in every shimmer of starlight, they felt his lingering presence. The Dawn era had ended, and the Merethic had begun. Yet fragments of the old time remained. Strange lights moved across the night sky, and echoes of the Aetida whispered through the forests. The Ayleids, attuned to subtle things, listened closely. They shaped their first songs after those whispers. Their voices, high and ethereal, carried over rivers and into groves, where they claimed the spirits of place would linger to hear. Unlike their Altmarai kin, who turned ever upward to Somerset's towers, the Ayleids sought the in-between spaces, caves glimmering with quartz, glades painted by moonlight, and the deep caverns where the earth's breath was cool. In such places, they built their first sanctuaries. Not cities, not yet, only circles of carved stone, etched with runes that caught the light of the constellations. These were the seeds of their faith and of their power. Their earliest myths tell of a time when the stars themselves were open doors. In dreams, they would walk through those doors and wander the hidden roads of Aetherius. Upon waking, they carried fragments of that otherworldly memory back with them. And so their culture grew, half in this world, half in the luminous beyond. Even their name, Ayleid, is said to mean those who walk apart. They were apart from the Neds, who would one day be their captives. Apart from their Altmare cousins, whose paths diverged toward rigid hierarchies and crystal law. And apart, even from the very land they walked, for they looked always skyward, longing for the unreachable. In the stillness of twilight, they told stories of the first lights, how Magnus tore a hole in the firmament when he fled creation, and how the stars that followed him became windows into eternity. The Ayleids swore that through these openings they could glimpse the eternal flame, the true source of magic. To them, every star was a blessing, every shaft of light a reminder of their origin. Their earliest gatherings were said to be gentle. There was no throne, no king to command them. Only circles of singers, priests, and dreamers who traced constellations with pale fingers, weaving spells not for dominion, but for wonder. They were explorers of thought, walking unseen paths of memory, testing the borders of dream. Yet within their wonder lay a seed of ambition. For when one can touch the stars and dream, one begins to long to grasp them in waking life. And so, the gentle singers of twilight would, in time, raise their hands not only to praise the heavens, but to draw down their fire and bend it into stone. But that was still far ahead. For now, the Ayleids were children beneath the night sky, wandering in the half-light of creation's afterglow. They saw the land as sacred, alive with the footprints of gods, and they walked with soft steps, fearful of disturbing the lingering echoes of the Aetida. And in their sleep, they dreamed. Always they dreamed of towers of glass and crystal, of halls glowing with the brilliance of stars, of white crowns and burning thrones. These visions drifted through their minds like gentle tides, promising futures both wondrous and terrible. Thus began the long story of the Ayleids, in silence, in starlight, in dreams that would one day turn to fire. The first stirrings of settlement among the Ayleids came not from conquest, but from reverence. When the wild elves chose a place to linger, it was almost always where light itself seemed to bend in sacred patterns. a shaft of moonlight caught in crystal, the gleam of a star mirrored perfectly upon still waters, the rhythmic pulse of Magicka, where earth veins ran deep beneath the soil. These were the signs that guided them. Their earliest homes were not grand fortresses, but flowing structures of living stone, carved as though the rock itself wished to embrace the sky. They favored smooth arches, polished walls that reflected torchlight like rivers, and domes pierced with deliberate openings so that the constellations might shine directly within. The Ayleids believed that if starlight passed uninterrupted into a hall, the spirits of Aetherius would walk there as unseen guests. They did not build for shelter alone, for their lives were entwined with ritual. Every chamber, every curve of stone, every glyph etched upon a doorway was a prayer. In the hush of evening, when shadows stretched across the grass and the air grew cool, whole families would gather in those halls to whisper chants to the heavens. To an outside eye, such gatherings may have seemed quiet, even austere. But to the Ayleids, the silence between chants was filled with presence. They claimed to feel the brush of wings, the glimmer of unseen eyes, the weightless company of powers too vast for mortal speech. From these first sanctuaries arose their myths of place. Each settlement was said to have been chosen, not by chance, but by a divine sign. One city traced its founding to a dream of a silver hawk descending from the stars. Another, to the discovery of a crystal that pulsed like a heart when touched by moonlight. These stories passed from one generation to the next, binding the people not only to each other, but to the land itself. The forests of Cyrodiil were alive with these myths. A tree older than memory became the dwelling of a forgotten spirit. A cavern where water dripped in steady rhythm was said to echo the beating of Magnus' own heart. Even the wind was believed to carry fragments of lost truths, and so the Ayleids would stand still among the branches, listening for hours to what others might dismiss as a breeze. Yet as they listened, they also learned. The people of the dawn were not idle dreamers. They observed the turning of stars with careful precision. They marked the rise of constellations upon smooth stones, and with patience they began to weave calendars that outlived any single life. They saw patterns between the seasons, between the waxing of the moons and the swelling of rivers. To them, knowledge itself was holy, and to record the movements of heaven was to brush against the very fabric of eternity. It was from this devotion that the first sorcerer priests arose. These are not kings, not yet. They were guides, interpreters of starlight, who read omens in the glitter of the sky and gave them shape in words. With slow voices and deliberate hands, they inscribed runes upon stone, each curve of the glyph drawn to mirror a constellation above. These writings were said to hold not merely knowledge, but living fragments of power. To speak them aloud was to call upon the very stars themselves. In time, the Ayleids grew more daring. Where once they had only etched stone, they began to carve entire caverns into flowing halls of light. They studied the veins of crystal hidden deep in the earth, embedding them within walls so that fire and starlight would dance together. When their halls were lit, they seemed alive, not static places of dwelling, but breathing sanctuaries, luminous as dreams. Still, they did not yet turn toward empire. Their hearts were bound more to wonder than to rule. They sought communion rather than dominion, delighting in visions and in the subtle touch of Magicka that hummed beneath every surface of the world. They were, at this stage, still children of reverence, though already the seeds of ambition stirred faintly among them. For even as they built, they dreamed of more, of higher towers, of halls that might pierce the very veil between Nirn and Aetherius, of stones not merely carved but awakened, glowing with eternal fire. In Whispers, the first Ayleid seers spoke of white gold, the impossible tower that would one day rise as both jewel and snare. They did not yet know what path such a vision would demand, but already they looked to it as if guided by fate itself. Thus their settlements grew, not in number alone, but in meaning. Every city was a poem, every stone a verse. Their homes were prayers made solid, echoes of eternity given form. And within them, the Ayleids began to walk a path that would, in time, lead them away from innocence and toward dominion. For now, though, they remained as they had been at the dawn, wanderers bathed in starlight, builders of sanctuaries, seekers of truth in the silence of the night. Their myths wrapped them in comfort, their halls glimmered with wonder, and their dreams drifted always upward, toward the stars that had given them birth. From the quiet sanctuaries of their beginnings, the Ayleids slowly turned their gaze toward permanence. The first carved halls of worship, once hidden beneath forests and stone, became seeds for something greater. No longer content with modest sanctuaries and scattered dwellings, they envisioned cities that would shine like constellations upon the earth. At the heart of this dream rose white gold. Legends say that the idea of the tower came first in visions, whispered to seers in the stillness of night. Some claimed they saw a pillar of crystal piercing heaven, its crown alight with fire, a beacon uniting earth and Etherius. Others swore they felt the ground tremble with magica, as though the very bones of Nirn demanded such a monument. Whether born from divine sign or mortal ambition, the vision took root. The white gold tower did not appear overnight. It was the labor of centuries, the work of thousands of hands guided by hundreds of sorcerer priests. Stones of luminous white were drawn from quarries said to hum with starlight. Each block was cut with precision and infused with glyphs before it ever touched mortar, so that the tower's bones would carry enchantment as naturally as flesh carries blood. When the foundations were laid, Ayleid priests sang to them in tones so low they shook the earth, binding word and stone together in ways that even today remain imperfectly understood. Around this tower grew the first true city of the Ayleids. The halls were not built in haste, but with deliberate artistry. Streets curved like constellations, their paths aligned to match the heavens above. Arches rose like frozen waves, flowing seamlessly from one district into another. Pools reflected starlight so clearly that night and water seemed indistinguishable. When torches burned in crystal sconces, the entire city glowed, a mirror of the sky set upon the ground. To walk within such a city was to step into living myth. Travelers from distant tribes, both mare and man, spoke of voices that lingered in the air like music, of lights that shimmered even when no torch was lit, of stone that seemed to breathe faintly beneath the hand. To the Ayleids, this was no mere construction, but a reflection of the heavens themselves. Their cities were temples, their streets were prayers, their towers were ladders meant to reach eternity. But white gold was not alone. Across Cyrodiil, other cities sprang forth, each a jewel of ambition. Vilverin, Bellerita, Seatatar, each bore its own character, yet all were united by a single impulse, to bring the heavens to Nirn through stone, light, and song. Some cities rose beside rivers, their reflections doubling the stars above. Others delved deep into caverns, where walls of crystal shimmered with inner fire. Whether beneath the sky or beneath the earth, the Ayleids built as if they were translating dream into form. The cities were more than dwellings. They were repositories of power. Beneath their streets lay chambers filled with sigils, carefully inscribed to channel magica in great currents. Pools of liquid light were gathered in hidden vaults, used to power wards, enchantments, and the endless glow that gave their cities their ethereal presence. Some whispered that these vaults tapped directly into Etherius, that the white gold tower itself was not simply a monument, but a conduit, a bridge between mortal and divine. The Ayleids believed that to live within such a city was to dwell in harmony with creation. To them, every arch was a hymn, every rune a verse of eternity. In the evenings, when twilight spread across Cyrodiil, voices rose in collective chant, echoing through the streets like waves upon a shore. Stars emerged, reflected upon polished walls, and it seemed as though the heavens themselves had descended to walk among the people. Yet beneath the awe and beauty, something stirred. For in building cities of such grandeur, the Ayleids began to see themselves not merely as keepers of starlight, but as wielders of it. The tower was proof of their mastery, a mark that they were no longer wanderers in twilight, but architects of destiny. They looked upon their own works with reverence, but also with pride, a pride that, in time, would harden into dominion. For now, the cities gleamed, their lights mirrored in rivers and skies alike. The Ayleids walked through radiant streets, certain that they had touched eternity. And in their dreams, they saw visions yet greater, of empires crowned in starlight, of mortals bending not only to the heavens, but to them. The first cities of white gold had been born, and with them, the future of both wonder and sorrow was set in motion. The white gold tower was not merely stone upon stone, nor were the cities that grew in its shadow simple dwellings. From their earliest foundations, the Ayleids sought to bind magicka into the very bones of their creations. They did not treat enchantment as a craft to be applied afterward, but as a living essence to be woven directly into the stone itself. Priests and masons worked side by side, their roles inseparable. A block of marble might be cut by hands, but before it was ever lifted into place, it was bathed in ritual flame, inscribed with runes, and sung to in tones designed to awaken resonance within. The Ayleids believed that every material carried memory, the echo of its origin, the whisper of its place in creation. Through magicka, they sought to shape that memory, to coax stone into harmony with their vision. Thus their cities lived. Walls glimmered faintly with pale fire, as though they remembered the starlight that birthed them. Arches thrummed with subtle vibration when touched, resonating like strings of an unseen lyre. Even the air seemed charged, carrying the faint perfume of blossoms not present, or the echo of distant voices. Those who dwelt within spoke of dreams more vivid, as if the very ground whispered to them while they slept. From this mastery arose the Sorcerer Kings. At first, they were not kings in the sense of conquest. They were the strongest of priests, those whose voices could command entire halls of stone to answer their chant. They guided rituals that spanned entire districts, summoning waves of light that washed across cities at festivals, or shaping enchantments so enduring that ruins still faintly gleam with their touch millennia later. Their authority was born of power, but also of awe. To the Ayleid people, these figures were not simply leaders. They were conduits through which the heavens touched Nirn. But power rarely rests in still hands. What began as guardianship slowly hardened into rulership. Sorcerer priests, once humble interpreters of starlight, began to claim thrones of crystal and ivory. Their words became law, their chants became decree. Those who resisted were not slain outright, but silenced through enchantments that stole memory or bound will. In this way, dominion grew quietly, without the noise of war, yet with a reach more complete than steel could ever achieve. The Sorcerer Kings adorned themselves not merely in finery, but in relics bound with magicka. Crowns of crystal whispered omens to their wearers. Rings of starlight tightened around fingers, glowing brighter when destiny shifted. Staffs carved from luminous stone pulsed like living veins, channeling spells that could level forests or summon fire from beyond the moons. To walk before such a figure was to feel the air itself tremble, as if reality bent in reverence. Their courts reflected this splendor. Halls opened into vast domes where light cascaded from enchanted crystals, never dimming, never fading. Servants glided silently through corridors, their steps softened by spells that muffled sound. Guests at feasts dined upon fruits that glowed faintly with magicka, their juices sparking upon the tongue like liquid stars. Music was performed not only with instruments, but with enchantments that drew tones from the walls themselves, filling the chamber with harmonies impossible to reproduce. It was beauty, undeniable and intoxicating, but beneath it lingered a shadow. For as the Sorcerer Kings elevated themselves, the common Ayleids became ever more bound to their will. What had once been a collective reverence for starlight narrowed into obedience to thrones. The memory of simple gatherings beneath the open sky faded, replaced by the weight of decrees uttered in resonant, commanding tones. And yet, for all their growing pride, the Ayleids still believed themselves instruments of the divine. The Sorcerer Kings claimed that their thrones were not seats of ambition, but altars through which they served the eternal flame of Magnus. They justified their dominion as necessity. Only through discipline, only through order could the dream of touching eternity be preserved. The people, lulled by beauty and wonder, largely accepted this. To live in a city that glowed like starlight was to believe in the destiny of those who ruled it. Thus, magicka and stone fused into a single tapestry, and the Ayleids passed from dreamers into rulers. The white gold tower, shimmering at the heart of Cyrodiil, stood as their crowning achievement, both temple and fortress, conduit and throne. It was proof that they had not merely walked beneath the stars, but had drawn their light down to earth. And so the era of the Sorcerer Kings dawned, an age of radiance, of power, and of pride. Religion was never separate from Ayleid life. To be Ayleid was to breathe faith with every breath, to see gods not in distant temples alone, but in each flicker of light upon stone. Their earliest prayers were whispers to Magnus, whose great withdrawal from creation left holes in the sky through which the people believed magic flowed eternally. Every star was a window, every beam a gift, and the Ayleids arranged their lives so that none would forget their origin in that endless light. The Daedra were revered as shapers and sustainers. The Ayleids knew their names: Akatosh, keeper of time; Arche, who sealed the cycle of birth and death; Mara, whose warmth softened the sorrow of mortality. Yet even in their reverence, the wild elves interpreted these deities through their own poetic lens. They saw Akatosh not only as a dragon of time, but as the very pulse of starlight, flowing endlessly. They imagined Arche's touch as a gentle tide that swept souls upward into the night. And they pictured Mara not in human form, but as the soft glow of twin moons reflected across still waters. Worship among the Ayleids was a practice of immersion. Entire districts of cities were designed as open-air sanctuaries where the heavens could be witnessed without obstruction. Temples gleamed with crystalline domes through which constellations shone directly. Priests performed their rites not behind walls, but in courtyards open to sky and storm alike, for to conceal one's self from the heavens was considered folly. Every festival was timed to celestial events: the rising of the warrior, the conjunction of the serpent, the eclipses of the moons. To miss a constellation's passing was to risk falling out of harmony with the eternal pattern. Their prayers were seldom spoken as rigid formulae. Instead, they were sung, voices rising and long, lingering notes that wove together into soundscapes resembling waves upon a shore. Listeners often described the effect as hypnotic, as though the chanting carried them outside their bodies. Some claimed that visions visited them in these moments, glimpses of radiant towers, shadows of beings who gazed back from beyond the stars. The Ayleids welcomed such visions, believing them confirmation of divine presence. In their devotion, the Ayleids also turned to natural places. Groves and caves served as living temples. A single shaft of moonlight falling into darkness was honored as a manifestation of Magnus' fire. Rivers were thought to carry Mara's song, and winds were interpreted as whispers from Akatosh himself. To wander the forests of Cyrodiil in those days was to stumble often upon circles of stone or gatherings of glowing crystals, each marking a place where the veil between Nirn and eternity was believed to grow thin. This devotion bound the people together. Before the rise of thrones and crowns, before slavery and rebellion, there was reverence. When families sang beneath open skies, they did so with the belief that their ancestors stood unseen among them, joining their voices to the chorus. In the hush after each chant, silence itself seemed alive, filled with the steady watch of stars. Yet faith was not static. The Ayleids believed the heavens to be ever-changing, shifting their constellations with subtle meaning. When a star brightened, omens were drawn. When a constellation waned, predictions of hardships spread through cities. Priests charted these changes with meticulous care, their scrolls filled with constellations mapped night after night, line by glowing line. It was said that some among them learned to predict events upon Nirn by reading the stars alone, as if the sky were both scripture and prophecy. Through such devotion, the Ayleids sustained a golden harmony. Their cities glimmered, their rituals brought comfort, and their voices rose nightly into the sky. They lived with the certainty that they walked in step with gods, that every breath of magicka through stone and star was affirmation of their place in eternity. But harmony is fragile, and where there is light, shadow lingers. For among the Ayleids, not all were satisfied to worship only the ordered deities of Aetherius. Some turned their eyes toward darker stars, whispering that power lay also in the shadowed corners where the light did not reach. Even now, beneath the tranquil beauty of their devotion, the first seeds of divergence stirred. For the moment, however, the Ayleids remained children of the heavens, bound in awe to the changing sky. Their prayers rose, their chants lingered, and the stars looked back with cold, eternal flame. For all their devotion to the ordered light of Aetherius, not every Ayleid found contentment in the embrace of the Daedra. The heavens shone brightly, but there were always shadows between the stars. In those shadows, some claimed, truths far greater than the soft certainties of the divines could be found. Where Magnus' light offered harmony, the darkness beyond promised possibility, raw, untamed, and perilous. Whispers spread first in secret circles. There were priests who looked into the night sky and asked not only what the constellations revealed, but what lay between them. The Daedra had given form and order to creation, yes, but they had also imposed boundaries. Life and death, beginning and end, growth and decay. All were cycles bound by the will of those higher powers. To some Ayleids, this was not reverence but restriction. They longed for freedoms beyond the walls of order, and in their longing, they turned their gaze toward the princes of oblivion. Temples of shadow began to rise alongside the radiant sanctuaries of Aetherius. At first, they were concealed within forests, their entrances hidden by roots and mist. Later, they took bolder forms, obsidian spires and caverns illuminated by eerie, azure flames. Where Daedra temples welcomed starlight and open skies, Daedric shrines closed themselves to the heavens, drawing worshippers inward, away from the gaze of Magnus. There, shadows flickered across carved idols, and chants invoked not the steady flame of order, but the chaotic hunger of oblivion. Among the most favored patrons of these Ayleids were Meridia, Molag Bal, and Azura. Meridia, radiant lady of infinite energies, was seen as kin to Magnus, her light both alluring and dangerous. Molag Bal was whispered of with equal parts fear and fascination, his dominion of domination appealing to rulers who desired unbreakable control. And Azura, mistress of twilight, promised visions beyond mortal sight, her gifts wrapping prophecy and curse into the same breath. Those who sought Daedric pacts claimed power unmatched. Sorcerer kings who once spoke only of harmony now wielded enchantments darker and sharper. Entire chambers pulsed with the unsteady glow of bound spirits, and blood sacrifices were whispered of in subterranean vaults. In exchange for worship, Daedra offered spells of domination, flames that could not be quenched, wards that defied even time. These bargains deepened the authority of rulers and set them apart from their subjects, elevating them into figures half divine, half terrifying. The people themselves became divided. Many still clung to the serene worship of the Daedra, their voices rising in soft chants beneath the open night. Yet others were drawn by spectacle, by the crimson fires, the haunting music of Daedric rituals, the tangible presence of beings who answered prayers not with distant silence, but with sudden, startling gifts. The dreamlike harmony of old began to fracture, and with each passing generation, the balance tipped further toward shadow. Conflict did not erupt openly, not yet. The Ayleids did not wage war upon one another over faith, for each believed themselves to be following truth in their own way. Instead, a subtler division spread through their culture. Cities devoted to Daedra gleamed with serenity, while those who favored Daedra grew darker, their beauty edged with menace. Travelers moving between such places felt the change palpably, the air heavier, the light dimmer, the stones themselves whispering with restless echoes. The duality of Daedra and Daedra worship became the essence of Ayleid civilization. It was both their strength and their doom. For in seeking both harmony and power, both starlight and shadow, they drew themselves into a paradox that could never hold. Their temples shone, their shrines burned, and between the two paths stretched an ever-widening gulf. Even so, the Ayleids embraced this contradiction. They saw themselves as keepers of all truths, children of Magnus, yes, but also allies of darker patrons. They believed no single path could contain the fullness of eternity, and so they walked both, weaving their destiny from threads of brilliance and shadow alike. It was a bold path, but one that carried within it the seeds of sorrow. For to welcome the Daedra was to welcome both gift and curse, both vision and ruin. The Ayleids, radiant and terrible, could not yet see the shape of what their pacts would one day demand. For now, their cities gleamed by starlight and burned with unearthly fire. Their priests sang to both heavens and depths. Their rulers sat upon thrones of light edged in shadow, and the people lived as though they stood at the very center of all creation. To walk through an Ayleid city at the height of its glory was to step into a living dream. Beauty was not an afterthought, nor was it reserved only for the thrones of rulers. Instead, beauty was woven into every corner of their world, crafted with such care that even the simplest objects seemed to hum with reverence. The Ayleids believed that art was more than expression. It was a bridge between the mortal and the divine. A sculpture of crystal was not merely an ornament, but a vessel, a resonant shape meant to channel starlight into subtle harmonies. A mural painted upon marble was not only a record of myth, but a living window, enchanted so that figures shimmered faintly when the moonlight touched them. Even tools bore elegance. Knives and bowls carved with runes, doors that whispered faint tones when opened, sandals embroidered with sigils that left patterns in the dust. Their architecture followed the same principle. No line was harsh, no wall flat. Instead, structures flowed as if sculpted by water and wind rather than chisels. Pillars bent gracefully, arches curved like waves, and windows opened not as voids but as luminous veils of colored crystal. At sunrise, entire cities would glow with prismatic fire, light scattering through enchantments to wash every surface in shifting hues. At night, the stones themselves glimmered with stored magicka, so that even in darkness the cities never truly slept. Particularly beloved were the living crystals, gems coaxed through magicka to grow like vines or branches. These luminous growths wound through walls and ceilings, blooming into radiant blossoms that pulsed softly as if alive. Some crystals were tuned to music, glowing brighter in response to chants. Others were enchanted to resonate faintly when touched, their tones adding harmonics to songs and prayers. To dwell in such a hall was to exist within an instrument of light and sound, a sanctuary where beauty and magic became one. The Ayleids also excelled in adornment. Their garments flowed with silken fabrics imbued with threads of silver and gold, shifting colors with the time of day. Jewels glowed with captured starlight, casting halos about the wearer. Even common folk, though far humbler than the sorcerer kings, adorned themselves with charms of crystal or bone, tokens carved with runes meant to ward, to bless, or simply to glimmer in twilight. Music, too, was central. They crafted instruments of impossible delicacy. Flutes carved from crystal that sang with ethereal clarity, harps strung with threads of magicka that shimmered when plucked, drums that echoed like distant thunder even when struck softly. Entire choirs would perform in vaulted halls, their voices merging with the resonance of enchanted stone until it seemed the city itself was singing. Travelers from other lands spoke of these performances with awe, claiming they felt lifted from the earth, suspended in currents of sound that blurred the boundary between waking and dream. But artistry was never separate from power. The Ayleids saw enchantment and art as inseparable halves of a single truth. A statue might delight the eye, but also bind a spirit within. A glowing crystal blossom might radiate beauty, but also serve as a ward against intrusion. Their artistry was dazzling, but it was also pragmatic, a way of harnessing the unseen, cloaking power within elegance. The legacy of this brilliance lingers still. Ruins scattered across Cyrodiil echo faintly with their craft. A broken wall may gleam with a ghost of stored magicka. Shards of crystal still hum when struck, their tones carrying into silence. Even after centuries of decay, their artistry endures, whispering reminders of a civilization that refused to separate beauty from existence itself. To live as an Ayleid in those radiant days was to be surrounded constantly by wonder. Every object bore meaning, every surface glimmered, every note of music resonated with eternity. Their world was woven of art, enchantment, and reverence, a tapestry of brilliance unlike any other known in Tamriel. And yet, beneath the radiance, another truth waited, a shadow born of the same hands that sculpted such glory. For the same civilization that coaxed blossoms of crystal from stone also shaped chains of cruelty. The contradiction lay hidden, but it stirred, ready to rise. Beneath the radiant glow of Ayleid artistry, another truth festered, a truth that cast shadows over even their brightest wonders. For though they sculpted blossoms of light and raised cities that sang with enchantment, the Ayleids also shaped chains, and upon those chains they built their dominion. Slavery was the silent foundation of their civilization. From the earliest days of white gold, Nedic tribes were drawn into bondage, taken from their villages, forests, and plains to serve as the laboring hands of their elven masters. The Ayleids justified this practice as natural, even ordained. To them, men were latecomers to creation, children of dust, fleeting, fragile, and bound to the cycles of mortality. Elves, by contrast, traced their lineage to the Aetida themselves. If they stood nearer to divinity, was it not fitting that lesser beings should serve them? Thus chains were forged, not only of iron, but of enchantment. Slaves were bound by wards etched into their very flesh, sigils that shimmered faintly and dulled the will. Whispers speak of collars that silence thought, of brands that seared obedience in a bone. In the darkest vaults, captives were made to fuel enchantments themselves, their suffering woven into spells that outlived their bodies. These practices were not universal, but they were common enough that cruelty became inseparable from power. The contradiction was stark. In the morning, Ayleids sang hymns to Magnus, praising the eternal flame. At night, they bled their captives in rituals to Daedric patrons. They sculpted beauty with one hand and inflicted torment with the other. To them, this duality was not hypocrisy, but harmony, a balance of opposites. They believed that light shone brightest when cast against shadow, that wonder grew deeper when nourished by pain. For the slaves, life was a cycle of toil and fear. They worked in the quarries that produced radiant stone. They harvested crystals that grew in caverns. They carried loads through streets that gleamed with enchantment, but offered no mercy. Some served in households, moving silently through jeweled halls, their eyes downcast to avoid the wrath of sorcerer kings. Stories endure of families torn apart, of children raised not as free beings, but as possessions marked from birth. And yet, amidst cruelty, flickers of humanity survived. Slaves whispered to one another in the dark, carrying fragments of songs older than their bondage. They carved hidden symbols upon walls, marks of memory that defied erasure. In the quiet of night, some prayed to distant gods who seemed far from the radiant cruelty of their masters. In these whispers lay the seeds of rebellion, though in these early years they remained small, fragile, and scattered. The Ayleids, for their part, saw themselves as artists of dominion. Just as they coaxed blossoms from stone and harmonies from crystal, so too did they shape mortals to their will. To them, the breaking of a spirit was no different from the sculpting of marble, an act of transformation, a display of mastery. They reveled in the paradox of beauty and torment, certain that through it they touched truths deeper than mercy could ever reveal. Travelers from distant lands who glimpsed this society often spoke of all laced with dread. They described streets glowing like constellations, but also slaves kneeling silently in the shadows. They marveled at music that seemed to lift the soul, even as they shuddered at the vacant eyes of those bound by chains of enchantment. The Ayleids, radiant and terrible, inspired both wonder and horror in equal measure. This was the contradiction at the heart of their culture. Luminous beauty built upon suffering, exalted faith entwined with blood sacrifice, art and cruelty fused into a single, glittering whole. To the Ayleids, it was perfection, a civilization balanced upon extremes. To those who endured their rule, it was tyranny wrapped in radiance. The seeds of downfall were already sown. For no matter how radiant the halls, no matter how brilliant the enchantments, no civilization can bind the will of others forever. In the silence of the forests, in the dark of the quarries, in the hushed prayers of captives, the embers of resistance smoldered. But for now, the Ayleids reigned supreme, radiant in their beauty, merciless in their cruelty, convinced that both light and shadow belonged to them alone. If the radiant halls of the Ayleids dazzled the eyes, then their libraries dazzled the mind. Hidden deep within palaces and temples, often buried beneath layers of enchantment, these repositories of knowledge were treasures greater than any jewel. To enter such a place was to feel one's thoughts expand, as though the air itself carried whispers of forgotten truths. The Ayleids believed that knowledge was both gift and weapon. What could be seen, they preserved. What could not be seen, they sought tirelessly to reveal. In their hidden chambers, scrolls of parchment lay alongside tablets of stone and crystalline tomes that shimmered with unearthly light. Each surface bore runes, diagrams, or formulae, arranged not haphazardly, but in precise harmonies. Words and symbols were aligned to echo constellations, so that the act of reading itself became a form of ritual, binding the reader into cosmic order. Foremost among their fascinations was magicka itself. Not merely the practice of spellcraft, but its essence, its mathematics, its rhythm. They did not see spells as crude tools to be wielded, but as patterns of eternity made manifest. Scholars wrote treatises in luminous ink, charting the flows of Aetherius as though mapping rivers across the sky. They described magicka in terms of ratios and harmonics, speaking of chords that resonated with the stars, of cycles that mirrored the heartbeat of the world. These were not idle musings. With such theories, they shaped enchantments of unprecedented subtlety. Crystals were tuned to absorb specific frequencies of starlight. Spells were crafted to ripple gently, lasting not hours but centuries. Even architecture reflected these principles. Walls and arches aligned to channel invisible currents, ensuring that an entire city might hum faintly with stored power. To live within such a place was to dwell inside an equation written in stone, a living formula of magic and art. Their pursuit of knowledge extended beyond the present. They were archivists of memory, hoarding fragments of myth, prophecy, and history alike. In secret halls, they preserved songs of the Dawn era, inscriptions in languages long forgotten even by other elves, and charts of constellations marking shifts so subtle they would not repeat for millennia. They guarded records of dealings with the Daedra, binding pacts written in tongues too dangerous to speak aloud. Such writings were sealed in vaults, protected by wards that sang like choirs when disturbed. Only the most trusted priests, scholars, or kings might enter, and even then only at great peril. Yet knowledge, like beauty, was not pursued for its own sake. The Ayleids sought mastery. They believed that to know the patterns of magicka was to place one's hand upon the loom of creation itself. If they could trace the rhythm of the stars, if they could grasp the equations that bound time and space, then perhaps they might transcend the boundaries of mortality. For this reason, their scrolls spoke not only of spells and wards, but of ascension, of apotheosis, of rising to stand among the Ayleid themselves. It was a dangerous path. Some scholars vanished into their studies, consumed by visions of formulas too vast to comprehend. Others achieved strange half-triumphs, bodies that glowed faintly with starlight but crumbled to ash at dawn, voices that echoed across distances yet never returned to silence. These were recorded not as failures, but as milestones, steps upon a ladder that climbed toward eternity. Few outside their kind ever glimpsed these hoarded treasures. Even among the Ayleids, access was tightly controlled, for to read a scroll of starlight was not merely to learn, but to change. Runes shimmered with enchantments that reshaped thought, bending the mind to align with cosmic order. Those unprepared risked madness, their senses overwhelmed by visions they could neither explain nor endure. Yet despite the peril, the Ayleids continued, fearless in their pursuit. To them, the greatest sin was not cruelty nor excess, but ignorance. Better to risk ruin than to remain blind to the patterns hidden in the firmament. And so they read, they calculated, they dreamed. They hoarded knowledge as kings hoard gold, convinced that in the gleam of starlit script lay the keys to eternity. If the luminous scrolls of starlight revealed the brilliance of the Ayleids, then the forbidden tomes revealed their hunger, a hunger so deep it reached into the shadows of oblivion itself. For every chamber filled with celestial equations, there was another chamber sealed by wards, where texts too perilous for open study lay buried. These were the books and tablets that whispered of Daedric bargains, of rights not meant for mortal minds, of truths best left untouched. The Ayleids never shied from such knowledge. Where others feared, they sought. To them, the boundary between Daedra and Daedra was not one of good and evil, but of light and shadow, of order and change. If the Daedra offered wisdom, they would listen. If they offered power, the Ayleids would seize it. And so the forbidden libraries grew, filled with tomes bound in alien materials, their pages flickering as though alive. Some books shifted when unopened, their runes writhing like insects in the dark. Others glowed faintly, as though embers burned within. Among the most dangerous of these were the records of pacts. Priests and sorcerer kings alike etched contracts with Daedric princes into crystal and stone, binding their words with enchantments, so the bargains could never be forgotten. These records spoke of tributes of blood, of sacrifices of flesh, of promises traded for knowledge of realms beyond Mundus. To read them was to sense the presence of eyes watching from beyond the veil, patient and expectant. There were also texts not of the Ayleids' making, but stolen or gifted, fragments of the Chimer's Velothi wisdom, preserved in amber-like resin. Daedric codices whose language seemed to resist translation, warping the reader's thoughts until meaning bled through not as words, but as visions. Even the Neds left traces, carvings upon stone that spoke of ancient spirits, taken by Ayleid scribes and reinterpreted to serve their own designs. Every scrap of lore was gathered, studied, and woven into their tapestry of power. Yet this pursuit was never without peril. Some who studied too deeply found themselves unraveling. A scholar might wake to find his own skin inscribed with runes he had not carved. Another might lose her reflection, seeing instead shifting landscapes of fire or storm. Others spoke in voices not their own, whispering prophecies that dissolved into laughter. Such fates were not pitied, but revered. The Ayleids considered them martyrs of enlightenment, souls burned away by truths too great for fragile flesh. Still, even they recognized that some texts were too dangerous to study openly. These they sealed in labyrinthine vaults, guarded by spirits bound into stone. To approach such a vault was to hear whispers at the edge of hearing, to feel shadows pressing against the mind. Only the most trusted could enter, and even they emerged altered, their eyes too bright, their voices too calm. The rest of society lived unaware, content with the radiance above while their masters hoarded shadowed truths below. It is said that in these forbidden chambers, the seeds of the Ayleids' downfall were sown. For though knowledge brought power, it also brought corruption. Whispers from Daedric patrons urged cruelty, excess, domination. The more they listened, the more they acted, shaping their society into a mirror of oblivion. Sacrifices once rare became common. Pacts once secret became celebrated in hushed ceremonies. They believed themselves closer to divinity, yet in truth they bound themselves more tightly to the whims of the princes. And still they pressed onward. To turn from forbidden knowledge was, to them, weakness. Better to risk damnation than ignorance. Better to burn in pursuit of truth than to fade into unknowing. And so their libraries grew heavier with shadow, their temples darker with flame, until the line between enlightenment and corruption was lost. Thus the Ayleids stood upon a precipice, their brilliance dazzling, their hunger insatiable. They gazed into the abyss of forbidden knowledge, and the abyss gazed back, its voice a whisper written in every rune. Amid the forests and rivers of Cyrodiil, one structure rose above all others, a monument so vast and radiant that it seemed less built than conjured, the Tower of White Gold. To speak of the Ayleids is to speak of this tower, for it was their crown, their axis, the gleaming heart of their dominion. Even after their empire fell, the tower endured, its stones whispering of an age when elves ruled not only with sword and spell, but with dreams of eternity. White Gold Tower was more than stone. It was a convergence of myth and geometry, an echo of the adamantine tower of Balfira, the first great spire raised upon Nirn. The Ayleids did not merely imitate that primal axis. They wove their own ambition into its form. Its base was broad and commanding, its shaft climbing heavenward until it pierced the very clouds, its crown a lattice of arches and spires that caught the starlight and refracted it in dazzling rays. Seen from afar, it seemed a beacon of divine order. The stone from which it was built glowed faintly in moonlight, kissed with enchantments that made it appear alive, shifting subtly with the hours. At dawn it gleamed pale gold. At dusk, it deepened into hues of rose and violet. In the dead of night, it shimmered with silver threads, as if recalling the light of Aetherius itself. Scholars would later debate whether this radiance was inherent to the stone or born of spells woven into every block. The truth is likely both, artistry and sorcery fused into one eternal form. Within, the tower was no less wondrous. Vast halls stretched upward, their ceilings adorned with constellations carved in relief, each star a crystal that pulsed gently with light. Stairways spiraled in patterns so intricate that they seemed designed not merely for passage, but for contemplation. Pillars thrummed faintly with magicka, their cores hollow and filled with liquid starlight. Every arch, every carving, was placed with intent, so that one walking through its halls moved not randomly, but through a living diagram, as though each step inscribed a rune upon the world. But White Gold Tower was not only temple and palace. It was also focus, a keystone upon which the metaphysical balance of Cyrodiil rested. Its foundations were set at a nexus of ley lines, channels of magicka that flowed invisibly through Nirn. The Ayleids knew these currents and bent them, anchoring the tower as a stabilizing pillar. Some whispered that within its deepest chambers lay a stone, a relic tied to the very laws of Mundus. pulsing with the rhythm of creation. Whether this stone was gift, discovery, or invention remains uncertain, but its presence made the tower not merely a structure of empire, but a device of cosmic weight. The mysteries of its crown were even greater. High upon its upper levels, chambers of translucent crystal were said to align with constellations, opening at certain nights of the year to draw in the breath of the heavens. Rituals performed there did not simply call upon magicka. They shaped the flow of fate itself. Kings were crowned beneath its spires, their sovereignty bound not only by law but by cosmic recognition. To stand at the pinnacle of white gold was to stand between earth and sky, mortal and divine, bound within the heart of eternity. Yet for all its grandeur, the tower was not merely a symbol of reverence. It was also a symbol of power, a statement to all who beheld it that the Ayleids were masters of both the visible and the unseen. Its shadow stretched across rivers and forests, a reminder to every Nedic slave and every rival tribe that dominion was eternal, radiant, and unassailable. The tower endured storms, wars, and centuries. It outlived kings and priesthoods, rebellions, and pacts. Even as the Ayleids fell, white gold remained, silent, enduring, watching. For it was never solely theirs. It was, and remains, a hinge of the world, a point where myth touches stone. To walk beneath its arches even now is to feel the echo of that ancient brilliance, to sense that within its walls the boundary between past and present thins, and the whispers of the Ayleids still linger, carried by the stones that remember. If White Gold Tower was the body of Ayleid dominion, then the ceremonies held within were its soul. For within those radiant halls, beneath constellations carved in stone and lit by eternal flame, the Ayleids wove pageantry into power. Their rites were not mere formalities. They were performances upon a cosmic stage, designed to bind king, priest, and people into a single rhythm, and to remind all present that sovereignty flowed from the tower as surely as life flows from the sun. Foremost among these ceremonies were the coronations of Ayleid kings. When a ruler ascended the throne, the event was marked not only by the placing of a crown, but by a series of rituals so intricate that they spanned days. Processions wound upward through the tower, each level representing a step closer to eternity. At each station, offerings were made, crystal poured with starlight, songs sung in the old tongue, incantations whispered to awaken dormant wards. By the time the procession reached the summit, the king had symbolically ascended from mortal clay to divine stewardship. At the pinnacle, beneath the lattice of spires that caught the heavens, the crowning itself took place. The crown was no ordinary circlet, but an artifact of layered enchantments, its surface shifting subtly as though alive. When placed upon the king's brow, it bound him not only to his people, but to the stars above, affirming his rule as recognized by both Nirn and Aetherius. Witnesses spoke of radiant light flooding the chamber, of constellations flickering brighter as if to bear silent witness. In that moment, the king ceased to be merely flesh. He became an axis around which the realm turned, a living extension of the tower itself. But coronations were only one among many rites. The Ayleids marked the cycles of the moons and the turning of the constellations with festivals of fire and shadow. During nights when Massar and Secunda aligned, the tower's upper chambers opened, releasing columns of silver light into the sky. Priests and mages gathered to chant hymns that blended poetry with mathematics, their voices rising in cadences that echoed across the forest below. To outsiders, it must have seemed music. To initiates, it was spellcraft, shaping unseen currents that sustained the empire. Other rituals bore darker tones. Within the depths of the tower, hidden from the gaze of commoners, ceremonies of dominion took place. Nedic captives, brought as living offerings, were bound in circles of light. Their blood was spilled not in wanton cruelty, but as part of equations, sacrifices calculated to align mortal vitality with cosmic resonance. To the Ayleids, Such acts were not atrocities but necessities, offerings ensuring that the tower's power remained unbroken. These rites revealed the duality of their nature: radiant and cruel, enlightened and ruthless, beauty entwined with shadow. Priests of the tower also maintained a calendar of prophecies. Certain alignments of stars were believed to open paths between worlds, moments when the veil thinned and fate could be rewritten. On these nights, rituals of foresight were performed. Crystals suspended in starlight revealed visions of empires rising and falling, of battles yet unspoken, of heroes not yet born. Kings consulted these visions before decreeing wars or treaties, convinced that the tower itself had whispered its will. Participation in these ceremonies was not limited to royalty and priests. Nobles, artisans, and even slaves bore roles in the pageantry. Choirs of voices filled the halls. Dancers traced sigils with their steps. Artisans crafted offerings of gold and crystal to be consumed by sacred flame. Each participant believed themselves woven into the tower's eternal pattern, and in truth they were, for the ceremonies reinforced the illusion that Ayleid dominion was not a matter of politics, but of destiny itself. Over centuries, these rites layered power upon power, until White Gold Tower stood not merely as architecture, but as ritual made solid. Every stone hummed with echoes of chants. Every corridor thrummed with cycles of offerings. Every chamber remembered coronations past. The tower was alive with ceremony, a living archive of dominion renewed again and again. Even after the fall of the Ayleids, traces of these rituals lingered. Later kings and emperors would inherit the tower. Yet beneath their ceremonies lay the faint memory of older chants, older sacrifices. For the tower does not forget. It carries within its stones the resonance of every word, every offering, every crown placed beneath its spires. And so the splendor of Ayleid dominion lives on, not only in history, but in the tower itself, whispering still of a people who sought eternity through ceremony and flame. For centuries, the Ayleids stood unchallenged, their dominions stretching across Cyrodiil like a canopy of radiant flame. Yet beneath this canopy, shadows stirred. The Neds, enslaved and broken, bore the weight of chains not only upon their wrists, but upon their spirits. And though the Ayleids believed their dominion eternal, the seeds of rebellion had already taken root, sown in silence, watered by suffering, nurtured in the secret corners of despair. The Neds were not without memory. Those centuries of bondage dulled their voices. Whispers of freedom lingered in their songs. Tales of a time before the lash, before the altars of sacrifice, were passed from parent to child, smuggled like contraband through the cracks of cruelty. These tales kindled embers, and in the quiet of night, the embers grew into fire. The Ayleids, in their brilliance and cruelty, could not fathom that those they deemed lesser might yet rise against them. The first rebellions began not with armies, but with refusals. A worker who laid down his tools and would not chant the hymns of harvest. A mother who fled into the forest rather than give her child to the altars of white gold. A band of hunters who turned their weapons not upon beasts, but upon the patrols that drove them deeper into servitude. These acts were small, scattered like sparks. Yet sparks, when cast into dry grass, can kindle infernos. In time, these refusals grew bolder. Villages of escaped slaves formed within the dense forests, hidden beneath canopies of green where even Ayleid patrols hesitated to tread. The rebels named themselves not as fugitives, but as free folk, bound together by oath and necessity. They forged tools into weapons, wove alliances with those tribes still untouched by elven dominion, and found strength in numbers where once they had only despair. The Ayleids answered with fire. Villages were burned, captives dragged back in chains, leaders flayed upon public altars. Each punishment was meant as a warning, a demonstration of the futility of resistance. But cruelty did not quench rebellion, it fed it. Every lash and every flame hardened the resolve of the oppressed. Where one leader fell, another rose. Where a village was razed, two more emerged deeper in the wild. The Ayleids had underestimated the endurance of humanity, and the Neds endured as stone endures the storm. In their struggle, the rebels found allies beyond their own kind. The Nords of Skyrim, ever eager for conquest, offered axes and warriors to those who would rise against the elves. Even among the Ayleids themselves, dissent brewed. Not all shared the zeal of white gold. Some clans favored mercy, or at least pragmatism, believing that endless cruelty would one day invite ruin. These dissident lords offered sanctuary to fugitives, or turned a blind eye to rebellion brewing at their borders. Thus the Ayleid dominion, though outwardly radiant, grew fractured within. The forests became battlegrounds. Skirmishes echoed among the trees, ambushes striking patrols, and watchfires burning as signals of uprising. To the Ayleids, these were irritations, inconveniences soon to be crushed. Yet each year, the rebellion grew larger, more coordinated, more determined. The once scattered sparks had become a blaze that licked at the very heart of Dominion. In time, the name of one leader rose above the rest. Alessia, a slave no longer content to whisper freedom in secret, she carried the fire of rebellion openly, forging it into a banner beneath which thousands would gather. Her story belongs to another part of this tale, but even before her name resounded, the rebellion had begun. The Neds had chosen to resist. They had chosen to rise, and in that choice lay the unraveling of Ayleid eternity. Thus the first cracks spread across the radiant edifice of empire. White gold tower still gleamed, and the Ayleids still believed themselves masters of destiny. But in the forests, in the rivers, in the hearts of the oppressed, a different destiny had awakened, one written not in radiant light, but in the blood and will of those who refused to kneel any longer. From the sparks of scattered defiance, there emerged a flame that no storm could quench. That flame bore the name Alessia. To the Ayleids, she was a slave among thousands, another voice to be drowned beneath the hymns of dominion. Yet to her people, she became something more, a beacon of deliverance, a living hymn of freedom sung against the cruel harmonies of White Gold Tower. Alessia's beginnings are veiled in myth, woven from both history and dream. Some say she was a priestess among the enslaved, whispering prayers in secret groves where the Ayleid shadows could not fall. Others say she was marked from birth, her spirit burning with the favor of the 8 divines, though the divines themselves had not yet been fully named. What is certain is that she gave voice to the silent. Where despair had taught generations to bow their heads, she taught them to raise their gaze toward the heavens. Her rebellion was not born from sword alone, but from faith. Alessia spoke of gods who did not demand blood upon altars, who did not see mortals as cattle to be harvested, but who cherished them as children. These words spread like water through parched earth, filling the cracks of despair with hope. To those who had never known choice, she gave the vision of a different world. Yet faith alone could not topple the tower. Alessia's genius lay in uniting the broken fragments of resistance into a single cause. She forged bonds with Nords from Skyrim, whose hunger for glory matched the Ned's hunger for freedom. She called upon sympathetic Ayleid lords, those weary of endless cruelty, and bound them in oaths of alliance. In her presence, scattered rebels became an army. Villages became fortresses, songs became banners, and despair became defiance. The divines, it is said, answered her prayers. Legends tell of visions granted to her in dreams, of the voice of Akatosh whispering promises of endurance, of the hand of Mara teaching her mercy, of the shield of Stender granting her resolve. Whether these visions were truth or metaphor matters little. To her followers, they were divine mandate. To fight under Alessia's banner was not rebellion. It was destiny woven by the gods themselves. Battles flared across Cyrodiil. Alessian warbands struck deep into the heart of Dominion, seizing fortresses and burning slave pens. Each victory was small, yet symbolic, proving that the Ayleids could bleed, that their dominion was not unbreakable. The forests echoed with chants of freedom, each victory feeding a tide that swelled beyond the Ayleids' control. But the struggle was not without cost. The Ayleids, though fractured, wielded magics older than the rebellion could comprehend. Their reprisals were brutal, villages scoured by firestorms, rebels broken by enchantments that turned air to chains and light to blades. Alessia herself endured torments, both physical and spiritual, yet she did not falter. Each cruelty only deepened her resolve, and each sacrifice only heightened her followers' devotion. The symbol of Alessia's rebellion became the Dragon Fire Pact, a covenant said to have been forged with Akatosh himself. In return for her faith and endurance, Alessia was granted the Amulet of Kings, a relic binding her bloodline to the dragon god of time. With it came the promise that her dynasty would endure, and that through her line the fires of resistance would become the fires of empire. Whether this covenant was truly divine or later invention, none can say with certainty. Yet to her followers, it was irrefutable proof that heaven itself sanctioned their cause. And so the rebellion ceased to be merely mortal. It became cosmic. The Neds no longer fought only against their oppressors, but for a future sanctified by gods. Alessia stood at the center of this maelstrom, no longer merely woman, nor priestess, nor slave. She was mother of the free, slave queen of Cyrodiil, and prophet of a destiny that would reshape Tamriel. As the fires of war spread, the Ayleids began to waver. Some doubled their cruelty, seeking to drown rebellion in terror. Others bent the knee, recognizing that the tide of history was turning. Yet even White Gold Tower itself seemed to tremble, its ancient halls resonating with chants not of dominion, but of freedom. The stage was set. Alessia had risen. Faith had become fire, and rebellion had become destiny. The fall of Ayleid dominion was no longer a question of if, but of when. And in that certainty, the age of radiant cruelty drew inexorably toward its twilight. When Alessia's banner rose across Cyrodiil, the rebellion became more than scattered uprisings. It became a war, the great war of liberation, a storm of faith and fury crashing against the radiant but faltering dominion of the Ayleids. For generations, the elves had ruled with fire and starlight, their sorcery unassailable, their towers unbroken. Yet in the forests and fields, an army was gathering, not bound by chains of fear, but by bonds of hope. The world itself seemed to shift, as though destiny leaned toward the side of mortals. The war began with battles fought in shadow, swift strikes upon supply lines, ambushes that bled the Ayleids of strength without challenging their armies outright. Alessia's followers were not trained soldiers, but farmers, hunters, and artisans turned warriors by necessity. Yet under her leadership, their courage hardened, their tactics sharpened. They learned to strike where the Ayleids were weakest, vanishing into the forest before vengeance could fall. In time, these skirmishes gave way to open conflict. The Nords of Skyrim marched south, bearing axes that bit through enchanted armor, their voices raised in thunderous war cries. Together with Alessia's rebels, they besieged Ayleid strongholds, tearing down walls that had once seemed eternal. Each victory sent shockwaves across Cyrodiil, emboldening the oppressed, fracturing the dominion further. The brilliance of the Ayleids dimmed, and the once unchallenged radiance of white gold began to flicker. Yet the Ayleids were not so easily undone. Their sorcery turned battlefields into nightmares. Storms of crystal rained upon rebel ranks, rivers boiled into steam, and fire that sang like choirs of agony swept through the forests. Warriors were unmade by light itself, their forms dissolving into ash and echoes. To face the Ayleids in battle was to stand against forces that seemed more divine than mortal. Many times, the rebellion teetered upon collapse, saved only by Alessia's unyielding faith and the stubborn endurance of her people. It was in this crucible that legends were forged. Tales speak of Nord champions who cleaved through battalions with axes glowing in borrowed starlight, of rebel mages who turned the Ayleids' own spells back upon them, of Alessia herself standing at the forefront of battle, her prayers weaving protection around her soldiers. Whether history or myth, these stories bound the rebellion together, transforming fear into determination. The climax of the war gathered inevitably around White Gold Tower. The tower, heart of dominion and symbol of eternity, could not remain untouched. For the rebellion to truly triumph, its radiance had to be dimmed, its spires brought low, its cruel ceremonies ended. Thus Alessia's armies marched upon the capital, their ranks swollen by freed slaves, Nordic allies, and dissident lords who had forsaken their kin. The siege of White Gold was unlike any battle before it. The Ayleids poured their might into its defense, unleashing enchantments layered for centuries, traps woven into stone itself, guardians of flesh and light conjured to bar the way. The rebels answered not with equal sorcery, but with sheer resolve. They battered walls with siege engines, tunneled beneath foundations, and hurled themselves again and again against gates that gleamed with unyielding brilliance. For days the battle raged, the air thick with smoke and cries, the earth trembling with the clash of wills. Some accounts claim the stars themselves dimmed during those nights, as though Aetherius recoiled from the violence unfolding beneath its gaze. Yet even amid the horror, the rebels pressed on. They fought not only for victory, but for survival, for the promise of freedom that had carried them through generations of bondage. At last, the outer defenses fell. The rebellion poured into the tower's lower halls, where centuries of ceremony had carved beauty into stone. There, amid the marble and crystal, battle raged hand to hand, each chamber won at terrible cost. Blood mingled with starlight, the sacred and the profane colliding in an unrelenting storm. White Gold, once the stage of Dominion's grandeur, became the crucible of its undoing. Though the war was not yet finished, the battles beneath the tower marked a turning point. The Ayleids, once unshakable, had been brought to their knees. Their dominion was no longer eternal, their radiance no longer blinding. The tower, symbol of their glory, trembled beneath the weight of rebellion. And in those trembling stones, the world felt the first true breath of freedom. The siege of White Gold Tower stretched on like an echo through eternity. Each day brought fresh sacrifice. Each night, new prayers whispered by weary rebels who gazed upon the radiant spire and wondered if freedom truly lay within their reach. The Ayleids, desperate to preserve what remained of their dominion, poured every fragment of their brilliance into the tower's defense. They summoned storms that split the heavens, unleashed guardians sculpted from living flame, and wove enchantments so old that even the most learned rebel mages struggled to comprehend their design. Yet, brilliance alone cannot preserve what the world has already condemned. Alessia's army, ragged and bloodied, endured where logic declared they should fail. For every wall rebuilt by sorcery, the rebels tore another stone away. For every enchanted host conjured in fire and shadow, another band of mortals pressed forward with blades and axes, and the stubborn will to live free. What the Ayleids could not understand was that the rebellion no longer fought as slaves. They fought as a people united, and unity proved a weapon sharper than any crystal blade. The final assault upon the tower came with dawn, when the mists of the Nibbins still clung to the earth, and the air lay heavy with silence. Alessia herself, clad not in shining mail, but in simple robes of white, walked before her soldiers, her voice rising in prayer. Accounts differ as to what words she spoke that morning. Some say she called upon Akatosh, binding the rebellion to the eternal flow of time. Others claim she invoked Mara, beseeching mercy for both the enslaved and the slavers alike. Whatever the truth, those who heard her felt their fear dissolve, replaced by a serenity that carried them forward through fire and blood. The gates of White Gold fell with a thunder that shook the valley. The rebels surged within, clashing with defenders who fought not only for their dominion, but for their very existence. Room by room, hall by hall, the The tower became a battlefield, its marble floors slick with the mingled blood of elf and man. Statues of forgotten gods toppled beneath the weight of battle, while sacred chambers once reserved for radiant rites echoed with the cries of the dying. The rebellion's fury, sharpened by centuries of torment, could not be contained. At the heart of the tower, the conflict reached its zenith. There, in the Hall of Radiance, stood the last of the cruel kings. Yumaril the Unfeathered, champion of half-divine lineage, armored in light that defied mortal steel. To the rebels, he seemed a being of nightmare, a fragment of Aetherius clothed in wrath. Against him, Alessia's host faltered, their courage tested by the sheer brilliance of his power. Yet even Yumaril, with all his heritage of terror, could not halt the tide forever. For faith and fury stood against him, wielded by mortals who refused to kneel. The clash was terrible. Legends say Yumaril's voice shook the tower, his laughter scattering courage like chaff before the wind. Yet the rebels endured, their resolve forged from centuries of chains. Blow after blow struck against his radiant armor, until at last even his divinity faltered. Yumaril was cast down, his light dimmed, his reign ended by the hands of those he had once enslaved. With his fall, the fate of White Gold was sealed. The tower, though scarred and broken, remained standing, no longer a symbol of cruelty, but of endurance. Alessia claimed it not as a throne of dominion, but as the hearth of a new covenant. Here the Dragon Fire Pact would be kindled, and from these halls a new order would rise, not of radiant cruelty, but of mortal sovereignty. The twilight of the Ayleids had come. Their dominion, once radiant beyond measure, lay shattered upon the stones of their greatest tower. Some fled into exile, vanishing into forests and ruins where their songs faded into whispers of memory. Others bent the knee to Alessia, trading dominion for survival. The brilliant empire that had once stretched across Cyrodiil was no more, its light dimmed to embers scattered across the wilderness. And in the silence that followed, the rebels wept. They wept for freedom gained, for lives lost, for centuries of pain that could not be undone. Yet in their weeping, there was also joy. The joy of dawn after endless night, of breath after suffocation, of the first steps into a future unshackled. White Gold Tower, once a beacon of tyranny, now stood as a monument to endurance. Its stones bore the scars of rebellion, and within those scars the story of mortals who dared to claim their destiny. Thus ended the dominion of the Ayleids, not in a blaze of eternal radiance, but in twilight, soft, inevitable, and final. The fall of White Gold Tower did not end the struggle of Cyrodiil. Victory in battle is but the beginning of a longer labor, the shaping of what will endure once the swords are sheathed and the fires grow dim. In the silence that followed Yumaril's defeat, the rebels stood among the broken halls of the tower and wondered what path would now unfold. Freedom had been won, but freedom itself is fragile, a treasure that demands care lest it be lost to division or ambition. Alessia, once a slave and now a liberator, found herself not only the spirit of rebellion, but the mother of a nation yet unborn. She gathered her people within the radiant yet scarred tower, its stones bearing witness to centuries of dominion and to the sacrifice that had brought it low. Here she proclaimed a new covenant, one not bound to cruelty or to shining arrogance, but to the shared destiny of mortals who had endured together. The Ayleids had ruled by fear. Alessia sought to rule by faith. Her words spoke not of conquest, but of unity, not of chains, but of choice. She called upon the divines, Daedra who had long been distant, yet whose names carried whispers of hope, to sanctify the birth of a new order. And in response, it is said, Akatosh himself answered. From a flow of time, he granted Alessia a covenant, the Dragon Fires, eternal flames that would burn at White Gold's heart as long as the covenant was upheld. These fires were more than ritual. They were a bond between mortal and divine, a promise that the world of men would endure so long as they remained true. Thus the first empire of Cyrodiil was born, not in radiant conquest, but in the ashes of rebellion. Alessia was crowned its first empress, though she carried not the trappings of dominion, but the humility of one who had walked in chains. Her throne was not a seat of vanity, but a burden, a symbol of the weight she bore for all her people. And yet, her reign brought a fragile peace. Freed slaves took up plows where once they had been forced to bear whips. Cities scarred by battle began to breathe again, their markets filling with the sound of life rather than the cries of torment. But peace does not arrive without shadow. The Ayleids who survived lingered on the edges of this new world. Some knelt, bowing to the covenant they had once defied, offering their knowledge in exchange for survival. Others fled into the wilderness, their hatred smoldering, their ruins becoming layers of bitterness. The forests and caverns whispered with their presence, ghostly reminders that the twilight of an age is never wholly complete. And there were those among Alessia's own followers who hungered for power, who dreamed of shaping the new empire in their own image rather than hers. Still, Alessia endured, her voice a constant prayer guiding her people toward unity. She established temples where the divines could be honored, weaving together the faiths of Nords, Nibonese, and even softened echoes of Ayleid belief. This new pantheon, born of many traditions, became the 8 divines, a living testament to the covenant that had given mortals their place in history. In this, Alessia was not merely a ruler. She was a bridge, binding together peoples who had once stood as enemies. As seasons turned and years passed, the first empire grew from fragile beginnings into a living order. The white gold tower, scarred yet unbroken, became its heart, no longer a symbol of tyranny, but of endurance. The dragon fires burned brightly, a constant reminder that their freedom was sanctified by the divine, their future tied to the covenant of time itself. To walk within the tower's halls was to feel both the weight of history and the promise of eternity. Yet even in this new dawn, shadows lingered. The Ayleids who remained in exile whispered prophecies of vengeance. The Daedra, once honored in secret shrines, still hungered for the devotion they had lost. And Alessia herself, though guided by faith, felt the burden of mortality pressing upon her. She knew her time would end, and that her covenant must outlive her flesh. Thus she began the great work of succession, the shaping of laws, the training of priests, the forging of traditions that would endure long after her voice fell silent. She entrusted the tower not merely to rulers, but to guardians of faith, so that the dragon fires would never fade. And in this, her final legacy was planted, a vision of an empire that would stretch not only across Cyrodiil, but across time itself. For in the ashes of the Ayleids, amid the ruins of cruelty and brilliance alike, something new had been born. A fragile flame, yes, but one tended with care, destined to blaze across centuries. Alessia, slave queen and saint, had given the world not only freedom, but a path into eternity. As the years passed, the first empire grew from the fragile dream of rebellion into a living realm, shaped by the hand of Alessia. She ruled not as a tyrant, but as a mother to her people, guiding them with patience, prayer, and the wisdom carved from suffering. Under her reign, the scattered tribes of Cyrodiil found common cause, their tongues and customs slowly blending into something new, something neither wholly Nord nor wholly Nibonese, neither slave nor master, but instead a people united by shared endurance. The Ayleids who remained within the empire were a diminished folk, stripped of their dominion and shorn of the radiance that once cloaked them. Some adapted, weaving their knowledge of stonecraft, enchantment, and song into the fabric of the new realm. These few found a kind of redemption, though they walked forever in the shadow of what their kin had done. Others retreated to their ruins, brooding in silence, nursing ancient bitterness. In those places the light of the past lingered like a fading ember, too proud to extinguish, too weak to burn again. Their laments would echo through hollow halls for centuries, whispered to the wind, remembered only by moss and stone. Alessia herself became more than mortal in the eyes of her people. They called her the Slave Queen, the Mother of the Empire, and, in time, Saint Alessia. Her voice, once raised in rebellion, became a hymn to unity. Her prayers, carried through the empire, bound the hearts of her people as surely as any chain had once bound their hands. The covenant of the Dragon Fires endured, burning brightly in white gold tower, a constant reminder that their freedom was sanctified by the gods themselves. Yet even saints must face the truth of time. Alessia grew old, her body frail though her spirit remained radiant. In her final days, she withdrew often into prayer, seeking the comfort of Akatosh and Mara, preparing her soul for the journey beyond. The Empire feared her passing, for they knew that her presence alone had been a shield against the chaos that forever threatened mortal realms. But Alessia did not leave them abandoned. She established priests to tend the Dragon Fires, guardians of the covenant who would watch over White Gold Tower through the ages. She entrusted her people with laws, traditions, and faith, gifts meant to endure beyond her flesh. It is said that when she passed, the Dragon Fires themselves wept, their light flickering as though mourning the loss of their mortal mother. In that moment, Alessia transcended mortality. Some say she was welcomed into Etherius, her spirit dwelling forever with the divine she had served. Others whisper that her essence lingers still within the tower, a guardian spirit bound to the covenant she forged. Whatever the truth, her people believed, and belief itself was enough to make her eternal. The empire she left behind would face trials beyond imagining, invasions, betrayals, and schisms that would stretch across centuries. Yet always at the heart of White Gold, the Dragon Fires burned, their glow a reminder of the covenant sealed in her name. Each emperor who followed bore the weight of her legacy, each soul measured against the flame she had kindled. And what of the Ayleids? With Alessia's passing, their twilight deepened. Their dominion was gone, their ruins swallowed by forests and rivers, their songs fading into myth. Yet fragments endured. Travelers spoke of hidden enclaves where pale lights glimmered in the night, where ancient voices sang in tongues no longer known. Artifacts of their craft emerged in strange places, crystal relics, enchanted stones, remnants of a brilliance too stubborn to vanish entirely. To walk through the wilds of Cyrodiil was to feel their presence, ghostly yet undeniable, like the lingering perfume of a flower long withered. In truth, the Ayleids never fully departed. They became memory, woven into the stones of the land itself. The forests of Cyrodiil carried whispers of their songs. The rivers reflected fragments of their lost radiance, and the ruins of their towers stood like solemn guardians of a vanished age. Mortals plowed the fields where once they had been slaves, yet beneath their feet the bones of Ayleid dominion slumbered, dreaming of the time when they had ruled in light. Thus the legacy of Alessia and the twilight of the Ayleids became intertwined, one rising as the other fell, one sanctified in flame as the other faded into shadow. The story of Cyrodiil was forever changed, for from this balance of dawn and dusk would emerge the destiny of empires yet to come. Long after the last Ayleid lords had vanished into silence, their cities endured as broken monuments, scattered across Cyrodiil like fragments of a forgotten dream. To wander the forests and river valleys is to stumble upon these ruins, half buried in moss and ivy, their once radiant stones now gray beneath centuries of wind and rain. Yet even in decay, they breathe with a presence that is difficult to deny. The arches rise as if defying time. The doorways open into shadows that seem deeper than mere earth, and the shattered spires point toward heavens that no longer answer them. Travelers who rest among these ruins speak of an atmosphere both tranquil and uncanny. In the hush of twilight, when the air grows still and the birds fall silent, the stones seem almost alive. Some claim to hear faint music drifting through the air, crystalline tones like the echo of harps long broken. Others describe lights that shimmer faintly, as though the ruins themselves remember the magics once woven into their walls. Skeptics call these tales fancy, the tricks of wind and imagination, but those who linger too long seldom laugh at such stories. For the Ayleids built not only with stone, but with song, with enchantment, with the living energies of Etherius itself. Their halls were once suffused with brilliance, every wall a hymn, every column a verse. Even in ruin, the residue of that artistry remains. A traveler passing through their empty courts walks not merely among broken masonry, but among memories, fragments of a culture that sought to bind eternity into every design. And though eternity is beyond mortal grasp, echoes of it linger, woven into each fading ruin. Yet what do these echoes whisper? To some, they are reminders of cruelty, the whips and chains that were once wielded beneath radiant spires. To others, they are symbols of beauty unmatched, glimpses of an age when artistry and sorcery were wedded in perfect harmony. Both truths coexist within these stones, as inseparable as shadow and light. Perhaps this is the deeper lesson the ruins offer, that greatness and horror often dwell together, that beauty can serve cruelty, and cruelty cloak itself in beauty. Pilgrims sometimes journey to these ruins not in search of treasure, but in search of perspective. To sit beneath the broken arch of an Ayleid hall is to feel small before the immensity of time. Empires rise and empires fall, yet the stones endure, indifferent to the struggles of mortals. One may close one's eyes and imagine the voices of slaves and masters alike, prayers whispered in fear, songs lifted in triumph, laments carried on the wind. In this way, the ruins become more than relics. They become teachers, reminding all who visit that no dominion is eternal, that the wheel of history turns unceasingly. Even the empire of Alesia, born from the ashes of Ayleid dominion, would itself fracture and reform, its glory waxing and waning across the centuries. White Gold Tower still stands, but it too bears scars of time and conquest, a testament to the impermanence of all mortal works. Against this backdrop, the scattered ruins of the Ayleids whisper their caution. Even the brightest lights cast the longest shadows, and even the most radiant towers crumble in the end. And yet, there is a certain comfort in their persistence. For though the Ayleids themselves are gone, their memory is not erased. The forest embraces their stones, rivers sing around their fallen bridges, the very earth cradles their remnants. Nature, patient and unhurried, has made peace with their passing. Perhaps in this there is a quiet grace, a reconciliation that mortals too may one day learn. Thus the ruins remain, not simply monuments to a fallen people, but reminders of the endless cycle of creation and dissolution. They are echoes of light and shadow, beauty and cruelty, grandeur and ruin. And as long as mortals walk the lands of Cyrodiil, the Ayleids will never be entirely forgotten. For in every vine-covered arch, in every crumbling stair, in every fragment of crystal half-buried in soil, their story lingers, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be dreamed anew. Night settles over Cyrodiil, and with it the world grows hushed. The rivers slow their songs, the forests sway in gentle rhythm, and the ruined halls of the Ayleids lie bathed in silver light. To gaze upon them in this hour is to glimpse a dream suspended between past and present, a memory preserved by moonlight. Though the Sorcerer Kings are gone, though their dominion has crumbled into dust, something of them endures in every silent stone. The Ayleids sought eternity through magicka, through architecture, through dominion. Yet eternity is not captured by conquest, nor held in chains, nor forged in crystal. Instead, it is found in remembrance. It lives within the quiet moments when travelers pause among the ruins and wonder what lives once filled these halls. It breathes in the tales passed from scholar to apprentice, from bard to listener, carrying fragments of their story into new generations. In this way, The Ayleids achieved what they could not in life, an immortality of memory, fragile yet enduring. There is, too, a gentleness to their twilight. Time has softened the sharp edges of cruelty, cloaked the darker halls in ivy, and blurred the bloodstains of rebellion with moss and rain. What remains now is not the lash of the slave master, but the curve of an arch against the sky. Not the cry of the oppressed, but the whisper of wind through hollow chambers. The forest has forgiven what mortals cannot, enfolding the ruins in its green embrace. To sleep beneath an Ayleid arch is to feel that embrace, a reminder that even sorrow is eventually cradled by peace. Legends tell that some Ayleid spirits wander still, guardians of knowledge too precious to lose, or shades too burdened to depart. Yet even these apparitions are described as faint, like reflections on water, their fury dimmed, their grief transformed into longing. They haunt not with malice, but with melancholy, as if yearning to be remembered with kindness rather than fear. Perhaps, in the end, all peoples seek the same, to leave behind a legacy not of terror, but of meaning, not of tyranny, but of beauty. For those who listen closely, the Ayleids still speak. Their language is no longer carried in words, but in stone and shadow, in the soft pulse of magicka that lingers beneath the earth. Their message is not of conquest, but of impermanence. They remind us that empires rise and fall, that towers gleam and crumble, that even the brightest lights fade into the night. Yet they also remind us that memory itself is a form of light, gentler, subtler, but enduring. As sleep draws near, imagine those ruins once more. Arches glowing beneath starlight, halls open to the sky, fragments of crystal glimmering like dew. Imagine the voices of the past dissolving into silence, leaving only the hush of the wind and the rhythm of your own breath. The Ayleids are gone, yet their dream remains, a dream of starlight woven into stone, a dream that lingers even now, carried upon the stillness of the night. And so the story rests, as you too may rest. Let the echoes of the past soften into distance. Let the weight of history become a gentle tide, carrying you further into calm. The ruins will keep their watch. The stones will dream their eternal dream. And you, listener, may drift into sleep, embraced by the quiet memory of a people who sought eternity in light, and who, in their own way, found it.